There aren't many occasions where having less money is better. I wasn't eating bourbon biscuit sandwiches for breakfast, lunch and dinner in uni out of choice, let me tell you that. But making movies is one of those rare instances where a lack of funds can actually be a good thing. When you have a limitless budget to rely on, it can induce laziness or indulgence in filmmakers because every single expensive shortcut is suddenly made available to them, and they're given the kind of unlimited power to realize their worst ideas. And when an issue does crop up on a film set, throwing money at it is rarely the answer. Do I even need to bring up Mustache Gate again? Sorry, not sorry. And without this option, filmmakers are forced to get creative and come up with solutions to problems that actually make the end result better because they had to compromise. I'm Josh from Whatculture.com, and these are 10 movies that were improved by having no money. Number 10. Halloween. John Carpenter's Halloween is widely regarded as one of the most influential movies in the horror genre, and that indelible image of the blank, expressionless mask the killer Michael Myers wears as he murders his way through the entire cast alone is enough to put the willies in you. Aside from perhaps Jason's hockey mask or Freddy Krueger's red and green sweater, there's not a more iconic bit of horror villain paraphernalia out there. And this is because Carpenter, being the creative genius and stingy bastard that he is, went out and stretched his budget of $200,000 any way he could, which also meant springing for ultra cheap costumes. In what proved to be his smartest bit of cost-cutting though, he didn't even have the prop guys make a unique mask for his villain. Instead, they spent a few bucks on store-bought Captain Kirk masks, painted them white, removed the 70s in space sideburns, and widened the eye holes for added peripheral vision for the actor, and added nightmare fuel for the audience. It was half-arsed in the best possible way. Number 9. Chasing Amy. Considered by Kevin Smith to be his comeback picture after his previous effort Mallrats flopped hard, Chasing Amy tells the story of the director's own sexual insecurities using a cast of relative unknowns, at least at the time. Ben Affleck and Joey Lauren Adams had both been in Dazed and Confused, but little else, and the only thing Jason Lee had done was Mallrats. Miramax, however, wanted to hedge their bets with a cast that included David Schwimmer, Drew Barrymore, and Jon Stewart. Smith fought them on this though, insisting that his friends were a more ideal cast for the type of movie he was wanting to make. To prove he was serious, he convinced the studio to give him just a fraction of the original budget, $250,000 instead of the initial $3 million, and let him make it the way he wanted. Then, if they liked it, Miramax could sign their name to it. It ended up being one of Smith's more well-respected projects among critics, and Adams even earned a Golden Globe nomination for her work. And, come on, could you imagine David Schwimmer saying a line like, well, lines I can't even say here without completely burying this video. I love him, but he wouldn't have been a good fit. Number 8. Deadpool. Yeah, okay, a director having $58 million to work with isn't exactly having no money, and it's not like Deadpool is some charming indie made on a budget funding by maxing out credit cards or the sale of spare kidneys on the black market, but in superhero terms, it might as well have been. Looking at the other comic book flicks which came out the same year, Batman vs Superman had a budget of $250 million, as did Civil War, while X-Men Apocalypse and even Suicide Squad had about $175 million apiece. At the time, Fox weren't willing to shift that kind of money on an untested character like Deadpool, and especially not on an R-rated superhero movie. Director Tim Miller and Ryan Reynolds constantly had to make compromises then, promising to bring the movie in under $70 million. Fox eventually agreed, but at the last minute slashed the budget by $7 million. The team were already working with little, and now they had even less. In retrospective interviews though, the filmmakers actually reflected on this demand as something of a blessing in disguise. Most of what had to be cut was the action, along with a few superfluous characters as well, which made for an overall leaner and tighter film that could hone in on what actually made Deadpool so special in the first place. When it comes to a film like this, I take more jokes over more action any day. Number 7. Back to the Future. If you had to rattle off a quick list of the most essential elements of Back to the Future, you'd probably include the DeLorean, plutonium, lightning, a clock tower, Libyan terrorists, and weird, incestuous themes. But amazingly, only one of those components was included in the first iteration of the movie, and yep, it's the one you're thinking of, the weird, sexy one, I know. At first, director Robert Zemeckis intended Professor Brown to develop a time travel machine that utilized a refrigerator instead of a DeLorean, and a nuclear explosion in lieu of the now famous lightning zap. Thankfully for us, Zemeckis had his budget sliced down, and his intended method of time travel, that being Marty hunkering down inside a refrigerator while a nuclear blast went off around him in the Nevada desert, was scrapped in favor of something much cheaper and much more creative. And yeah, that idea does sound pretty epic on paper, but if you really think the original concept would have turned out better, you may just want to go ahead and watch the idea be reused for Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It didn't work out so well, but speaking of Indy. Number 6. Raiders of the Lost Ark. By now, most people know the story behind the infamous fight scene between Indy and the Egyptian swordsman. Showing up on set that day, Harrison Ford had contracted a major case of the paps and wasn't really feeling up for a big duel. So he suggested to Spielberg that he simply shoot the guy instead. Spielberg loved the idea because it meant his expenses for the day would be even cheaper. Less film, fewer takes, and a hell of a lot less time spent on choreography and on shooting. And although a full-fledged sword fight probably would have looked damn right cool, the finished result added more to the character than any legitimate combat could have. It wasn't just that scene which benefited from a budget-minded director either though. Spielberg has admitted that had he had the time and money provided to him on his other films, Raiders would have turned out to be a bit of a pretentious film. He even credits the quick pace of the production as being the primary reason for the brisk, trim-looking finished project as a whole. Number 5. Rocky. Even though the Rocky franchise is now a household name that's featured the titular boxer solving the Cold War with his fists, buying a sex robot for his loser mate, and inspiring just about every movie montage since the 70s, the original was a surprisingly toned-down affair. The focus is less on the boxing and more on Rocky's desire to amount to something, all the while courting his lover, Adrian. In one of the most romantic scenes of all time, seriously, I'll cry just thinking about it, Rocky takes her out to an ice rink late at night, with the two of them skating and enjoying each other's company. The iconic sequence wasn't actually planned though. Sure, the two were supposed to go on an ice skating date, but just at a regular time, surrounded by a bunch of other hopeless romantics. With the shoestring budget, the production couldn't actually afford the extras necessary to make a bustling ice rink look realistic, and they altered the scene to make it this personal, romantic gesture instead. Number 4. Jaws. Steven Spielberg's Jaws was one of those rare disaster movies that barely actually showed the thing causing all the chaos. Instead, the director utilized brief shots of the shark's fin sticking out of the water and quick cuts away from its face. But this wasn't intentional, and in fact, if Spielberg had a bigger budget for the film, he would have certainly featured the shark a lot more. Unfortunately for him, but fortunately for us, the 3 mechanical sharks used, all nicknamed Bruce by the way, shit the bed on a regular basis, short-circuiting and requiring routine maintenance. To make matters worse, production was already over budget, and they couldn't afford to build new, longer-lasting props. According to Spielberg, this is where the idea of the unseen enemy came into play. Thinking like his hero Alfred Hitchcock, Spielberg used whatever creative solutions he could muster to show the shark without actually showing the shark. So you get a few shots of the fin sticking out of the water, and you see the lower half of the victim wading from the shark's point of view, and then you see them getting thrashed around on the surface of the ocean. And let's face it, that's far scarier than seeing old Bruce's gormless face every 20 seconds. Number 3. Clerks. Clerks was made on the paper-thin budget of $28,000, which Kevin Smith got by maxing out his credit cards. When you're making a movie for so little and using your own money, it's not going to take a lot of prodding to cut back on what other major motion pictures might consider necessities. This is where the idea to shoot the whole thing in black and white came from. If it went full color, a good chunk of the money would have been spent fixing all of the lighting issues in post, since Smith filmed at an actual store where he worked and could only shoot when it was closed, so he had no natural light on hand. In black and white, Smith could use whatever random light and source he needed without worrying that the color temperatures wouldn't match up continuity-wise. Also, there was one scene in the script they couldn't afford to shoot at all. In it, Randall and Dante are at the funeral of a former classmate when Randall accidentally knocks over the casket. It was an uncharacteristically slapsticky scene, which was thankfully cut out of the script, all because Smith couldn't afford to rent the funeral home. Number 2. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Although Monty Python and the Holy Grail was made on a tiny, tiny budget with Pink Floyd, Genesis, and Led Zeppelin all pitching in, no, seriously, Terry Gilliam and the rest of the Pythons found many brilliant ways of making that work to their comedic advantage. Little things like the so bad they're hilarious killer rabbit effects are scattered throughout the scenes, but the most enduring running gag is also the result of these crafty budget solutions. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table aren't nearly as majestic as the writers envisioned them as being, largely because the sight of grown men galloping on their own feet whilst other grown men follow behind banging coconuts together doesn't really inspire a lot of nobility. Of course, they wanted actual horses for all of those scenes, but simply couldn't afford them. The idea to use coconuts of all things as a substitute came from a trick used in old radio shows. Python just took it a step further by cutting the crap and showing the people actually doing it on camera. Number 1. Star Wars. Forget Luke Skywalker, Gary Kurtz is the real hero of Star Wars. He was the one with the daunting task of pulling in the reins on George Lucas whenever his brain started to dream up madness their modest budget could never possibly realize. On the set of A New Hope, Kurtz's job was apparently just stressing out over Lucas's ambition. It wasn't enough to have a few different species of aliens, George wanted hundreds. They couldn't just focus on a couple of planets, George needed a universe. But being the budget guy, Kurtz wasn't afraid to step in and advise him on how to scale it back, which actually helped craft the Star Wars universe we know and love today. His mentality not only gave us the design of the Millennium Falcon, constructed from old junk parts of cars and planes, but it also played a key role in the formation of arguably the most famous sidekick of all time, Chewbacca. Initially, Lucas's script was twice the size of the finished draft, and in that rough version, he wanted to feature an entire army of Wookiees. That sounds awesome, but to cut down on the runtime and budget, they scaled it way back to just one, which did make a much greater, more personal impression and birth one of the most iconic characters of all time. So that's our list. I want to know down in the comments below which movies I missed that also benefited from having no money, and while you're there, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to whatculture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, you've been watching What Culture, and I'll see you soon. Bye.